I worked with this woman, this tenant leader, and I would sit at her kitchen table and watch these other African American women sit around that table in these projects being run by a slumlord. And they would sit there and strategize about how to take care of the kids in the community, how to keep a family in their housing when they missed a rental payment. I stood there and I watched them thinking about how to support that community, and I found it. I found conspirators. I found people coming together, and they weren't just in those projects all over Newark. I saw more and more people who had a courage, who had a spirit, who had a love. And so for my Father's sake, I want to explain to you the three things that these conspirators all had in common. One was they embraced discomfort. They did not seek comfort and convenience. They went to where the challenges were. Here were people around me in Newark doing extraordinary things outside of their comfort zone. Like the man who was a retired state worker that got his stimulus check in the mail, and instead of just spending it on himself, he went out and got a lawnmower, marched into one of our troubled drug lots. There was this big grassy overgrown field with trash and debris, and he started cleaning it. He made it look like the White House lawn, never confronting a drug dealer, but eventually they left. Like the woman who came to me in my office hours, an 80-year-old woman complaining to me about how dirty her street was, and the next day I go out there, and here's this 80-year-old woman outside of her comfort zone, on that street, sweeping the entire block, showing that he who has a heart to help definitely does have a right to complain. It's about the guy I know who was driving to work in Newark and didn't like the graffiti. And instead of just driving by it and accepting what was, like so many of us who just fall into a state of sedentary agitation, when we're upset about what's going on, but we don't get up and do something about it. He stopped at a store and began making a routine out of his commute to work where he would stop and take paint and paint over graffiti. In my city, I see that conspirators know do not go through life comfortable. Democracy is not a spectator sport. It is a difficult, hard, challenging, full contact, competitive, participatory endeavor. And this is critical. People who get comfortable of body get fat. People who get comfortable of mind and intellect get dull. People who get comfortable in their spirit, they miss what they were created for. They were created to magnify the glory of the world, not simply reduce in size and fail to reflect that spirit. I've come to learn in my life to embrace discomfort because it's a precondition to service. I've come to realize to embrace fears because if you can move through fear, you find out that fear is a precondition to discovery. I've learned in my life to embrace frustration because when you get really frustrated, that is a precondition to incredible breakthroughs. And this brings me to the final point of conspirators that my dad and my community have shown me is that conspirators are the ones that show up. They just show up. And what do I mean by that? I mean that we go through life all the time, but we don't always show up. We may be there in body, but we're not there in spirit. And we begin to erode the truth of who we are. We fail to live our authenticity. A great President Lincoln said that everyone is born an original, but sadly, most die copies because they don't show up. I've learned that what you think about the world says less about the world than it does about you. And when you show up in this world and have the courage to tell your truth in moments big, but more importantly, in moments small, then you are the architect not only of your own destiny, but you're the architect of transformational change. Showing up. Forgive me, I've got just a bad story about that, but I was on my way to Stanford as a freshman, coming back to the farm. And here I got on a plane and it was packed with people, but somehow God shined his grace upon me, because as they closed the door to the plane, there was 2 seats open next to me, and I thought to myself, look at all these other people. It's such a shame that they have to deal with all that cramped space, but I have this whole seat. God obviously loves me more than them. Well, just as I was sitting there so satisfied, the door to the plane opens, and all of us shot to attention because it sounded like some beast was coming in. Some screams were happening. We couldn't understand what was going on outside of the plane. And then we understood, because the beast came onto the plane and it had 3 heads. It was a woman and a little boy and a baby. Immediately, everybody on that plane looked at them and then slowly turned their heads to me. And I could see everyone was thinking, you smug little man. And that woman and her 2 children came to stand before me and said, I'm sitting there. And I said, are you sure? And they moved in and they sat down, and immediately, as a 19-year-old man, I suddenly had an evolved thought that I could accept this now as being the worst flight of my life, or I can make it different. Because in life, you get one choice over and over again. That is to accept conditions as they are, or to take responsibility for changing them. To yield to the circumstances around you, or to show up and do something about them. I decided that I was going to make this the best flight of my life. I started telling this little boy jokes, and he started laughing at my horrible jokes, like my grandfather would love. Like, why did Tigger and Eeyore have their heads in the toilet? Because they were looking for poo. Like, why? What do you call your mother's sister who runs away and gets married? An antelope. I'm sorry, I had to try. By the time we landed, we were all having a ball. The woman who came on the plane, embarrassed, suddenly felt like she was lifted. We exchanged addresses as I was getting ready to come down here to the farm, and we never kept in touch. But 5 years passed, 10 years passed, 15 years passed, and I was running for mayor of Newark. On my most discouraged day in that campaign, I got a letter from this woman saying, you don't remember me, but I met you on a flight to Stanford 15 years ago, and I will never forget your kindness then. She said to me, not only do I remember your kindness, but we're actually here in Newark. We own a factory here. Her son became a great volunteer on my campaign. They got me involved with their company, and she ended up being something that all politicians love, a campaign contributor. Show up